As Olivia mentioned a moment ago, we've seen the Yes campaign spring up in a number of different forms today. One that continues to bubble away comes from within the Liberal Party, where a group of current and former Liberals have gone against the party line to support the Yes campaign. And that was Julie Bishop campaigning with Penny Wong today. Who would have thought? Another one of those Liberals who is supporting the Voice referendum is the former New South Wales Premier Mike Baird, who joins me live from Sydney. Mike Baird, thanks for your time. You're part of this Liberals for the Voice movement, in the minority, I'd have to say, in the Liberal Party. Why did you agree to be part of this, and what would your argument be to Liberals as to why this should be enshrined in the Constitution?
Well, look, Andrew, I mean, obviously I'm doing a range of things at the moment, not least of which is leading Hammond Care in the aged care sector, and obviously that takes a lot of my time. On this issue, I mean, I've got views. I mean, my view is that it would be helpful, and it comes down to a pretty simple principle. There are huge challenges with our Indigenous communities across the country. Mark Speakman, the leader of the opposition here in New South Wales, I think put it really well. I mean, he said, just look at some of the facts, that a young Indigenous male is more likely to end up in jail than going to university. A young Indigenous woman is more likely, 30 times more likely, to be a victim of domestic violence than someone who's not. Now, those statistics are just the tip of the iceberg across the community. So what we're doing is not working. Now, is this the solution? Well, time will tell whether this is going to help. But if it does, why wouldn't you try it? And why wouldn't you invest in all pieces of legislation being considered and getting a voice into them? So from my point of view, this is incredibly constructive. I get where the debate is. My hope is the debate is done in that constructive tone. We respect everyone's voices. It's not for me to tell anyone how to vote. That's up to individuals. Get the information, get your own understanding. But when you think about it, from my point of view, it's pretty simple. There is a chance to make a difference. We should listen to it, and that'd be my view.
Do you think, though, the PM could have handled it differently, legislating the Voice first, for example? I mean, he says if the referendum fails, he won't move to legislate a Voice. I asked him, well, if it's so important, why wouldn't you? Because maybe it's the permanence of the thing in the Constitution that is putting some people off.
Yeah, and that's a very valid point, Andrew. And look, as I think about this debate, I mean, my hope would be that there's one last chance for the Prime Minister and the Leader Opposition to actually come together. Like, there's a lot of similarities. There are things they agree with. It might take some compromise on both sides, but I think for the good of the country, for the good of Indigenous communities across Australia, I think it would be a great thing if there was one last chance to try and find that unified position. I mean, I think that some of the issues that you've raised, you can see there are concerns, there are questions. They need to be addressed. But what about if we had one last attempt at unity? For me, I think that'd be a great thing for the country.
And without that resolution, because Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese don't seem to agree, you say vote yes, because obviously you don't see it as that big a constitutional change, but you do believe it can make a difference.
I think it can, Andrew. I mean, like in a simple. I mean, I've had the privilege of being in Parliament. I've had the privilege of bringing laws to effect. To have and yes, I consultate. There was consultation. I personally consulted. There was consultation undertaken from various groups. But to have a regular voice to the Parliament, I think could make a big difference. I think of things just in simple terms. You think of NDIS. You think of the Gonski education funding. What would a voice have said to those legislations? Are things we could have done differently? And yes, there are things that were done with those communities, but it's just a good example. Significant pieces of legislation, significant impacts across the country. I just think it would be very helpful to lawmakers to have that voice.
Now, I will ask you to put on your main aged care cap now, and the intergenerational report Jim Chalmers released last week put aged care as one of the key areas of concern when it comes to the strain on the budget in future years. What measures should governments consider to improve this problem?
Well, I mean, the intergenerational report, I've seen a few of them, and the problem's getting worse, not better. when you see them. So we do have the ageing population, we have those working less in terms of the income tax base is shrinking at the same time. So we have a huge problem. And this government, to its credit, has opened up the question of how do we actually continue to fund aged care to the level we need to long term. In simple terms, those that have the means, should likely contribute more. That's one of the key principles being considered. But everything's on the table. And, from my point of view, this is a point in time. There are recommendations that were part of the Royal Commission. This federal government has said, let's consider it. Let's consider all options, because what we are collectively united on is actually having an aged care sector that is sustainably funded. So looking at how we increase that funding is critical, because, day in, day out, I've got the privilege of seeing unbelievable workers all across the country that are trying to provide the best possible care. That is something we need to continue and enhance. And there is more funding coming, but it's not going to be anywhere near enough to fund,
do you
as
think
the generational report talks about.
Do you think that there needs to be some more form of user pays?
Look, I mean, they're the sort of things that are being considered. Are those that have the means potentially contributing more? That is something that's definitely being considered. But, obviously I can't talk about where we're going and how the task force makes recommendations. There's a very simple proposition. There isn't enough funding, when you look at the intergenerational report, to meet the needs of our elderly and those that go into the aged care system in the long term. When you have those over 75 doubling in 40 years and those over 85 tripling, we have to find a way to fund and support them. So, that's what this report's about, and that's what this task force has, this opportunity to help make the aged care system sustainable, to look for additional measures that can come in. And it's also looking, how do you attract super funds to play a role in the aged care sector? How do you bring banks further in to play an additional role? So everyone that has an opportunity to bring capital, to bring support, additional funding, that's what the task force is looking at.
And when you were New South Wales Premier, you called for a 15% GST rate, but it looks just too hard to get governments to take this on, doesn't it? Are you still a supporter of this kind of change in the tax mix? Doesn't these close federal elections make this a bit more difficult?
Well, the good news is, Andrew, I've had my time in public life. I've made contributions to the tax debate and many other debates, and that's over to others now. But look, I mean, what the intergenerational report says, that there are undoubtedly some changes that need to be made across the long term for Australia, including tax mix. So, that's on to new leaders now, but obviously the intergenerational report poses the question, here's the problem, then how are you going to solve it? That's obviously up to governments down the track.
All right, you're enjoying your role as Chair of Cricket Australia, I imagine. What do you think of the future of the sport in Australia in competition with sports like football? We seem more time poor these days. Do you think kids and parents have enough time for cricket to keep growing?
I'm very excited about the future of cricket. I mean, I think anyone that has watched cricket in the past few years has been quite captivated. The Ashes series was something that gripped the nation. The World Test Championship, there were 132 million people that tuned into that. So the future's bright. Our women players continue to dominate on so many levels, and great to see the Matildas pick up the work that many of our women players have done. So it is an exciting opportunity. There's commercial challenges, but I see them as opportunities, and most importantly, we're seeing a rise. At this stage, this year compared to last year, registrations are up 100%. So there's real interest in the game. We're seeing the women's game grow in particular. So it's a great time to be part of cricket. So, those parents that are considering changing sports because of time, stick with it, because we need future Australian Test champions.
And look, while I've got you, just finally, I feel I have to ask for a reaction to the corruption findings against your successor, Gladys Berejiklian. You may choose not to want to buy into this, but you ultimately gave evidence to ICAC. She should have declared her relationship. Do you think ICAC made the finding it had to in relation to this matter?
Oh, look, obviously I've made some comments in relation to that. I'm not going to sort of provide any further commentary. Gladys is a long-term friend, obviously a very difficult period, but it's not it's not for me to comment further.
Mike Baird, thanks so much for your time this afternoon.